Hey, everybody, and welcome to part 3 of our Advanced GM little series within our Your Best Game Ever video series that we're doing. I'm Monte Cook. With me is Darcy Ross. And today we're going to kind of wrap up Advanced GMing, although, there's so much more that we could be talking about. But, that's a good reason to go check out Your Best Game Ever at yourbestgameever.com or your favorite local retailer because it's out now. But today we're going to talk about kind of some weird stuff that has to do with narrative and sort of creating tension. And then we're going to kind of wrap things up with, what to do, how to learn from your mistakes and whatnot, because we all make mistakes as GMs.
Oh, yeah.
But let's start off talking about some weird things that you can do with narrative. And what I mean by that is, why I say they're weird is a lot of the things that we're going to suggest here aren't, the kind of traditional player takes an action, NPC takes an action kind of thing, right? And like, for example, one of the things that I will start off with is the idea that, how when you watch like an action movie, like particularly a James Bond film, right? It starts off in the middle of some interesting action sequence and all kinds of stuff happens. And then it kind of sets the mood and gets you in that James Bond frame of mind. And then we get sort of the plot and the story and everything. Well, you can do that a little bit with an RPG session by starting things off with action. It doesn't have to be combat, right? But starting things off with action, even if you didn't leave off the last session in the middle of action, because if the obvious example here is, the player characters like rest in the woods for the night, and you end the session. You start the next session by saying, all right, roll initiative, right? And wolves or something are attacking them while they're in camp. And once you resolve that action, you can then go back and say, okay, well, you guys were camping last night, but you were all woken by the howling and snarling of wolves. And so that's a really interesting thing that you can do to just kind of start things off rather than starting things off with, okay, well, you have breakfast, and right. It's just a kind of a more interesting way to do things, even though you're not following straightforward linear structure.
Mm-hmm. It gives it momentum, right? The questions of, oh gosh, what happened that, how did we get here? Right. is an exciting question. So you've already raised questions. People are excited. And like, it just kills the, when you sit down for a session, like there's already momentum you have to sort of build to sort of to stop whatever you're doing for the day before and start what you're doing here at the table now. And so if you could have the narrative not also have to have that sort of wind up, if you can give them something to sort of, warm up in, combat's really nice because it's structured often, right? And so you can play through combat as you're warming up your other narrative gears.
Right.
I think you're doing your players a lot of favors when you can start things off with a bit more like higher energy than so what's happening, Give them something to react to and it'll start the whole session off faster.
Yeah. And I think that in the same way that you can kind of jump ahead to the good bits, right? You should also feel empowered to skip over the bad bits. Mm-hmm. And here's what I mean by that, right? We've all been in the situation where, we're fighting, the big bad wizard is dead and defeated, and all you really want to do is go, get his loot and get his magic book and everything. Yeah. But he's still got these 8 ogre servants, and you got to slog through the fight with them. But it's anticlimactic, right? The wizard's dead, the kingdom is saved, whatever. Just skip it. I mean, we all know the players are going to finish off these ogres or whatever, and it's a foregone conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
A way that you can look at this is the way I look at things. The rules in the game are there to answer questions, right? Like, who's stronger, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can look at the stat sheets and see who's stronger. Who would win in a fight, right? The player character or the orc? And you can look at their stats and you can roll dice and see who would win. But if there's no question, if there's nothing at stake, then the rules aren't needed, right? And you could just narrate your way through. Okay, you finish off the ogres, or the ogres all run, or whatever.
Yeah.
And there are probably other kind of situations of foregone conclusions too. What's another example, Darcy, of?
Let's see. So it's, like I've played sort of investigation games that have gone on a long time, right? And there's just when you're playing a character who's rooting around for information, often over many days of in-game time, right? Like what you choose to have on screen and off screen, you have to be really choosy, or it can just go on forever, right? Because you can continue looking for information forever and ever, and you'd only be hitting that kind of I search for clues story beat, and it'll get really stale. So a lot of times, someone's looking for a house, right? Like one of these houses, had the murderer must have hidden in one of these houses. Which is it? It is a foregone conclusion that if the player searches all the houses and is reasonably competent, that their character will find the relevant information. And so, maybe give it a bit of narrative set dressing, validate the awesome abilities of the character that helped them get to that clue. But, please save everyone the beat by beat. I search a house and nothing's in it. I search a house and stuff is in it, but nothing of relevance to the investigation, right? You can get really into the weeds of red herrings, and there's a lot of dangers that can come from over narrating things that don't have good stakes or don't have good information to be gleaned from, right?
Yeah, I think that a great rule of thumb there is, if this is a scene that they wouldn't show in the movie, yes. then don't have it play out at the table, right? And honestly, your players aren't going to feel cheated. They're going to feel relieved if you just say, after searching the whole neighborhood for 6 hours, you stand in front of the house that you now know is the one that you're looking for.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Right. The only approaching a caveat I have about this is that some games mechanically have prepared their characters for boring scenes by giving them lots of abilities that make them chew through, so some players might have built like a big beefy combat character, and all their abilities are about big beefy combat, and maybe they have some abilities about killing weakened enemies, right? About mowing down sort of near death or low level creatures. And so to some extent, when you elide over bits of that combat or bits of narration where players might be making rolls, investigation rolls, all sorts of stuff, you can deprive them of some of their abilities. Or, I know some people some games give you currency when you fail a lot of rolls. And so the game almost needs you to make a certain number of rolls to sort of be getting weird game currencies flowing to the table. But I think the answer to this is, let those players get those roles in when the stakes are better, right? If a character was, if a player was sad because they didn't get to spend an hour, mowing down all these lower level enemies, make sure that if you think you might be running against this, where you're sort of taking away a situation where a player might be having some fun, make sure you follow it up with a really cool combat where it does matter that they get to use all their abilities. Don't think of it as, I've fallen into the trap of oh, I have to let this go on because this person's built a character that wants to do this kind of thing, and it's just not worth it, right? give them a better combat, a better investigation to get those rolls out and to validate their character abilities. I think I fell into the trap of feeling like I needed to GM through certain scenes, and you have so much power as a GM. You can insert scenes later. You can have cool flashbacks and have quick, how did you mow all them down? Make a couple quick rolls and we'll narrate through it, right? You have so much power if you play with the narrative timing and sort of structure of your game.
There are different ways to reward a player's focus on a particular ability, right? Mm-hmm. Like the obvious, if you've put a lot of stuff into combat, the obvious way to reward that is to have a lot of combats where they get to roll their dice and whatnot. But if I'm the player and I've made this combat monster character and the GM just says to me, you are so powerful, like your might with that axe is so legendary that these ogres don't stand a chance, and you just hew through them all with great aplomb and don't take any damage and barely get any blood on you, right? And so I'm going to feel like, oh, I am a badass, right? Yeah. I mean, that is validating. Mm-hmm. So we're not talking about skipping over the parts that people love, mm-hmm. but we are talking about maybe using narrative in a different way, right? And not letting the rules necessarily run the narrative. The humans around the table should run the narrative, right?
Totally. So one type of pacing or timing or narrative tool that GMs can use is flashbacks. And this can be something that I've used a lot at the beginning of campaigns to sort of give us some material to work with leading into where we're starting the campaign. But you can also use it all sorts of other places. What's your advice on, flashbacks and what they do and how to use them most effectively?
I'm also a huge fan of flashbacks, and I actually really like it when the flashback has some narrative weight. And so what I mean by that is the player says, they're coming into a weird unknown area, and the player says, well, I'm not sure, but maybe my character's actually been here before, right? Flashback time, right? And you suddenly flash back where the player is there before, right? And you kind of play through, not like hours and hours, right? But you take a few minutes, play through, have them learn some interesting things, flash forward again, and now they have information that they can use, that they have actually learned, in character at the table, but it happened out of sequence, right?
It's such a good way to break up info dumps too. If especially in these sort of investigation things or when you've been explaining a lot as a GM, it's so refreshing for me as a GM to get to turn that part off and get back into speaking more in character, right? Rather than just telling a player what their character knows. Right. I think it's really refreshing too for the other players because it's more of a cinematic experience. Like it does get into a bit of the showing and not telling. I think like depending on the pacing of the session, right? Sometimes it's the right call to get narrative about information. And sometimes you just need to give them a quick detail and move on, right? So I think like, just like taking a quick breather, taking 5 minutes, just like having a sudden interjection of a scene or a sudden exciting thing helps you tune the pacing of this session. Like if you have the space for it and people are eager to be living in a moment, a flashback is a really tight little bottle moment that you get to sort of set the stakes, set some exciting momentum, like it's a way to really change up the energy of the scene and of the session.
You can also give a lot of impact by having something change. Mm-hmm. Right? So like to use the example I was saying before, right? Oh, you have been here before, and you do a flashback, and they find out some stuff or whatever, and then you go flash forward, but there's one notable thing that's different now, right? And suddenly, rather than, like you said, rather than just saying, oh, and you notice this wasn't here before, they will notice, right? You're showing and not telling, and that's really an interesting thing that you can do. And don't be afraid to, like, even kind of mess within certain parameters, right? Within reason, mess with continuity a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if the flashback is to the character's background where they're learning how to, jimmy a lock, and then you flash forward and now they have the skill to jimmy a lock. I mean, that's not cheating. That's cool, right? If you saw that in a movie, it would be cool, and you'd say, oh, that's how he learned how to jimmy locks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, feel free to play with that narrative. In fact, so speaking of, like, seeing things in movies, this is going to be utter heresy to some GMs, but this is advanced GM techniques. And it's different from a flashback. It's the offstage scene. And what I mean by that is, you, as the GM, narrate a scene that the players can't, rather, the characters have no knowledge of, right? But the players do, right? So suddenly, you take 5 minutes and you cut to the villain's lair, yep, right? And you see the villain talking to her henchmen and saying, these horrible, evil people are, foiling all my plans, and now we're going to have to, release the Kraken or whatever. And then cut back to the players as they see the Kraken rise up out of the ocean, right? All you're doing there is giving flavor and context, right? And sure, it's out of character knowledge, but it's going to make the experience for the players at the table better, because they're going to understand why what's happening is happening.
Yeah, there's a line you have about I think it's in the book, about when we're thinking about tone or mood, our audience, like, it's the players whose immersion is important, not the characters, right? And so, I think it's really easy to get caught up in, the characters are windows to the world. They're really important. We're playing a role. It's important that, we understand what they're seeing through that role, and that the story makes sense and involves them. But we, the humans around a table, are the audience, right? So what the storytelling we want to do needs to please us, the players, and it doesn't have to only come from our characters, right? So I think that's a really good point. It's so fun.
If you want to take this kind of thing sort of to its ultimate, I think, along a million years ago, I wrote a Planescape adventure called Dead Gods. And in Dead Gods, there's a point at which the GM says to all the players, okay, make up new characters. And you suddenly are in a completely different place and time. You're playing a different character. And it becomes clear as things go on that you're actually playing a character in the far distant past. And you're playing out this scene that, in the course of Dead Gods, the regular current players actually do find out through a magic item what happened to the prior characters. But even if you don't want to take that step and you just want to show some interesting thing that happened in the past, having the players actually experience it firsthand rather than just, learning of some legend of what happened in the past is so powerful, right? It also gives you the opportunity to, be heartless and cruel with those characters, because you know, it happened a long time in the past. We already know they're dead, one way
Yeah.
or another, right? So, you can do whatever, and then have the players find out that there was this group of adventurers that once came to this place once before, 500 years ago, and did X, and everyone's going to be like, yeah, we know that because we were those people, right?
Yeah. I'm thinking of that scene in like the opening scene of Guardians of the Galaxy, where there's an artifact that Star-Lord has that's letting him see some sort of recording of the world, of the ruin that he's in when it was really beautiful and alive. And so, I think you can have players, if you get to play a scene where you're playing with time, when the place that they were in was really different. It can give this feeling of where once you were just walking through some melancholy, some sad, gross crumbling ruins. Now you get to feel the loss in a totally different way, right? What this place could have been, what it once was to people, and the stories that they had. I just think you can absolutely change the context of that session, of that moment when those characters are in that place. Even if the characters don't know, the players know. We know the loss. We've been there. We know what this great place used to be. And then, of course, it's really, it can be extremely powerful. It's a great point.
And then related to that is the idea of sort of the single character side scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Where, we make use of that in Invisible Sun. And Darcy, have you had any really good experiences with side scenes in Invisible Sun?
Oh, so many. I love side scenes. So, side scenes are often kind of like downtime scenes. They're, a little like goal that a character has, or an opportunity that the GM sort of presents their character with. Often this is really helpful for like character fleshing out. You're sort of constrained when you're all together at the table to tell the most interesting story you can with the players who are there. And I think that's a great goal, but you're really relieved from those constraints, and can dive into some more intimate or nuanced or particular element of something that character wants or something that player wants, right? So something that I've really enjoyed is like, I love NPCs. I love getting to play them as a GM. I love getting to interact with them as a player. And side scenes are great for, NPCs shouldn't be the focus of my campaign play, because I made these characters and they're supposed to be the ones that matter. But I can really elevate that NPC and get to have these really cool interactions in side scenes, because I know I'm not stealing spotlight from anybody else at the table.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah. So side scenes, are maybe just one or two characters, and they empower the player to, like you said, right, take on something into the narrative that doesn't involve the rest of the group, right? Mm-hmm. So you're not constrained. We sort of all believe, well, I shouldn't have a goal. I shouldn't want to do a thing that doesn't involve everybody else. But if you allow for a side scene, which it takes place, away from the regular session, you kind of are empowering a player to have a sort of more natural sort of flow and goals that maybe just only pertain to that person. And the cool thing about side scenes, or one of the cool things, is you don't have to even have the same kind of constraints that you have in a regular session. You can do side scenes via text, right? You can do it over the phone. You can do it via Skype or whatever. You can meet at a coffee shop for 20 minutes, because probably they're not going to involve a lot of mechanics and whatnot. Right. You're probably not going to have a big fight side scene or whatever. But you probably are going to have a lot of interaction, like with NPCs, like with what you said, or finding out information. So it breaks the narrative structure that we're used to.
Mm-hmm.
But but I think for very good reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been so enamored of side scenes. And, like you talked about how, side scenes kind of emerged as, you and Bruce and folks would be walking around and just talking about what your character would do. Right. And so you're having these, just casual, like, rules like conversations about it. And, I'm sure there's plenty of people who like play by post, right? Which, and do sort of collaborative role-playing experiences on forums. So it's not like this is, absolutely new, a totally new way to play, but I really don't feel like there's a lot of script for it. I really don't feel like there's a lot of guidance about how to integrate it into, most role-playing games. So if I can speak to anyone who's interested in this, like, having talked to a lot of GMs who have been running side scenes lately and basically pestering them for their advice, one of the best tips that I've picked up so far is, because there isn't as much of a script for side scenes across role-playing games, and because many players will be totally new to it, set some expectations about, like, have a tiny conversation, maybe even just one question about what you're looking for in that side scene. Like, Brandon Ordang had said at the beginning of every side scene that he does for Invisible Sun, he will ask, do we want to role play this out, more deeply, or do we want to have a bullet point kind of sketch of what happens? And I think setting that expectation, I've gone into side scenes that I thought were going to be bullet points, and they turned into many hours of, dialogue. And I'm like, I'm not a writer. Oh my gosh. So it's been really exciting, but it feels a little bit like the Wild West to me, because it's just so different from the usual narrative structure of role-playing games, I think. But it's different in really exciting, powerful ways. So do try it.
And like we said, Invisible Sun makes really, really heavy use of them. But Your Best Game Ever also kind of talks about how to use them in any game, right?
Absolutely.
Plug.
We got it.
So if we're talking about narrative, something that writers talk a lot about when they're crafting a story is tension. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't mean the bad kind of tension that we don't like, right? I mean the tension of story, right? Mm-hmm. And the biggest part about that is raising the stakes, right? You sort of have, and again, I'm using fiction terms here, but they apply, right? You have the inciting incident, right? That's we would call that the adventure hook, right? The thing that gets the thing started. But, I think we talked in adventure creation, I think we talked about 3-act structure, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to want to have something in Act 2 that raises the stakes. Right. How do you like to do that, Darcy?
I think often, so I'm a very like backfilling GM, I think, right? Because I really love reacting to what my players give me. And so a lot of times what I'll do sort of in this, I'm looking for an opportunity to raise the stakes. Maybe I have an idea about, the players thought X was going on, but really it was something more like Y, maybe I come in with an idea like that, but often I really like to tie it to what my players are giving me. So, if there's a person that they've keyed off of or that they really trust, now that person is tied up into this conspiracy, right? Like who can I, so I'm always like changing the modules of how to raise the stakes by figuring out where my players' investment already lies, like what story or what theory they already have that they're really passionate about. I'll either that's such a good idea that I'll go with it, or I'll purposefully twist it and have the have part of the tension be that, oh, we thought we were pursuing this idea that we thought was correct, but actually we were wrong all along, and we've been the baddies, right? So I love twisting things on players a little bit.
I think that that's brilliant because what it really does is that it focuses on the storytelling medium that is that is unique to role-playing games, the storytelling process, right? Because if you're just sitting at a keyboard and you're writing the story, you're the only one participating. And so, of course, when you raise the stakes, when you move things into Act Two, when you put in the twist, it's all right. But listening, we talked last video about listening, right? And picking up on what the players are interested in makes it a group storytelling experience, right? And anytime where the GM where the GM can back away from being the storyteller and let the group tell the story, I think that's great. I think that's fantastic. Another way to raise the stakes is to make things personal, right? I mean, that's the cliche, right? This time it's personal, and
cliche because it works.
Because it works, exactly, right? So, if the inciting incident makes it so that in Act One we have to save the village from this marauding horde of undead that's coming in, right? Suddenly making it so that the players suddenly have a connection to one particular NPC in that village by the end of Act Two. Now it's not just, oh, we're nice guys and we're nice people, so we're going to save the village. Now it's, oh, we have to help the village because of this person that we now think is awesome, right? And it suddenly makes everything much more personal. Or that maybe that person is even someone who they had a connection with before, right? So there's a lot of really interesting things to do. Like, if you're trying to save the town from a plague, and by Act Two, one of the PCs starts coughing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, so good. One of the things that the times where, hitting the players where it hurts worked best, that I was just so impressed by my GM, just absolutely blew my mind and changed, galvanized the whole campaign, like made the players furious for weeks, right? Like we couldn't look at him. He had hurt us so bad personally, and we loved it, right? But we were so mad. He was running this Planescape game for us, and we'd gone on these missions, and we were really powerful. We were doing all this cool stuff, and we had completed all these missions, and our boss was like, you've been doing, you just completed this big thing. To thank you, we're all going on vacation together. And so we have this vacation episode, and we spend a whole episode like goofing off, right? We're like participating in drinking contests, and we're playing with the mechanics, and we commission like matching mugs with like our characters, like triumphantly, like in these poses on these like big like steins, beer steins, right? And at the end of the session, we can't find our boss. And so we're looking for him, and we find that, he's been turned into this like horrible monstrosity, and he's basically undead at this point. And so the one of the characters like puts him out of his misery, basically. And so we like kill our boss because he's like irreparably, horribly monstrized. And we are all so furious at the GM. This like the big bad was not even a big bad before. We didn't care. Now it was like, God forbid that Peter ever wanted us to focus on anything other than revenge, because we were all 100%. So I guess my advice is, like, if you've identified a heartstring, let it grow a little. Give it some love, because it will hurt that much more when you pluck it. But I guess be prepared to be glared daggers at for a while from your players. If my similar.
Yeah, boy, we could probably do a whole video on just like setting things up, because I think you're absolutely right that don't necessarily fire the trigger right away, right? Mm-hmm. Like in the current game that I'm running, the Invisible Sun game, the sort of big bad, right? The main villain of the piece was introduced because he was the mean ex-husband of an NPC that they thought they were kind of getting into one sort of adventure, right? Oh, let's help this woman who's got a mean ex who's doing crappy stuff. And, it wasn't until much, much later that they realized that he was actually, in a completely unrelated way, right, the person who they were going to hate the most. Mm-hmm. And what that enabled me to do as the GM was build up a very personal animosity for this guy, so that when it turned out he was just also, a real threat, they sort of already wanted to, smack him around, right? And it heightened the tension, right? Mm-hmm. It raised the stakes, but almost in reverse, right? Because they just sort of didn't realize that I was plucking on the personal heartstrings before the main plot actually even started.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other ways that I've raised tension. And, I think one thing that's really helpful when I'm considering, adventure design, and as we've said before, adventures are a little bit bullshit, just a little. But when I'm
glad you keep bringing that back, because I agree.
But there's sort of the face of an adventure that you're going to vaguely buy into, even though you kind of know it's bullshit, right? And so that might be, well, you're going to get paid gold, and so you have to deliver this thing. Fine. That's probably not really the tension, right? Is it like, sometimes it is, but a lot of times what I found really useful is like, thinking about what else is happening that's going to make this unexpectedly like hard or difficult, or lead players to have to make a hard choice, right? And so the ostensible adventure might be something like, go deliver this letter to this, earl of some long forgotten kingdom. But the question is going to be, actually, like, this will give the earl a whole lot of power, and so the actual tension of that session is going to be, do you piss off the people who hired you to do this and like lose out on, maybe have them come after you? Or do you empower this like kind of, at least morally gray character to screw over someone that, an NPC that's particularly likable? So putting them in these tight spots where they have to make decisions that really feel like they'll matter, is like the much more important piece of the design for me. It's like, what I think often when I'm adventure designing or session designing, I want to think about the hard choice, the tension, the stakes that are being set, and almost a lot of the other stuff, especially for episodic adventures, can be set dressing, right? It's just stuff to get me to that tense moment, right? To that hard decision, to an action that the players have to really struggle with.
It can actually be something like the inciting incident can actually be something that has nothing to do with, it just gets you in the right place, right? Like, to use your example, right? You're delivering this message to the Earl, and you arrive and the Earl is dead.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so the actual adventure is who killed the Earl.
Yep.
But there was no way to get them to that point without giving them sort of the bullshit.
Breadcrumb. Yeah. Yeah. And to be fair, the bullshit framework can be really useful when you're just trying to figure out, why should my character be here? And sometimes it just serves like a convenience of like how, and you can see this in like TV writing. Sometimes there's this like convoluted kind of bullshit reason that we really wanted these characters on screen together, right? And that's fine. Like, use that bullshit to your advantage. Don't get caught up in the realism of it, or making that inciting incident like the most perfectly designed thing. Focus your efforts on the actual tension and the real fun and meat of the session.
Yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm. So the only other thing that I wanted to add about tension is, the tension of the unknown.
Mm.
And anybody who's played any of my games of recent years, right, whether it's Numenera, Invisible Sun, The Strange, knows that I love to fill my settings and games with the unknown. And it's because it creates a tension, right? Questions are interesting. Answers are less interesting, right? There's a reason why the word quest and question are very closely related, right? Because really everything, if you think of every adventure, everything that the players are going to do as we're looking for the answer to a question, it's a very interesting way to think about things, right? Even if it's just, how are we going to stop the evil necromancer from raising an undead army? Or, what's at the bottom of this dungeon, right? Even if you're talking about sort of the most simplistic, straightforward kinds of adventures, thinking them in terms of a question is great. And the reason that I make that point is because the more you can inject the unknown into the game, the more tension, interesting narrative tension you're going to have, it's one of the reasons why dungeon adventures are still around, is because there's the tension of what's going to be behind that door, what's going to be around that corner. And the more that you can inject that kind of thing into every adventure that you run, even if you would, never go into a dungeon, it's a very useful tool. And like every time you get an answer to a question, if that raises yet another question, you both get the satisfaction of finishing progress, but still more to do, right? The most boring setting in the world is the one where the players know and understand everything that's going on, right? Because the real world certainly isn't like that.
Yeah, I can always tell when I've succeeded at that. Often when a session ends and you can just, the players are still like sorting through the implications. They've completed a thing, but they are sort of reeling in all, stewing in all these new questions that you can just tell is going to carry their excitement into the next session. So I'm always looking out for that. And sometimes I think I've given a straightforward answer, and I find out that they're drawing up some wild implications, and that's great fodder for me to lean into mysteries that they've sort of raised too. So I like to do a lot of listening to my players once they've heard an answer to a question. I do have a question for you. Bad segue. But sometimes I've given players, players have discovered an answer to something that I think is going to raise all these questions, and they're like not picking up on it. And so that can be a little tough when they're sort of, clapping their hands and patting themselves on the back. How do you raise those questions to them? Do you let them, or do you say, I could see two ways to go initially, have an NPC sort of ask them some leading questions, or validate some of their skill choices that say, actually, your extreme training in botany, something feels a little off about that piece, right? And to cue them to think about it. Another piece might be they don't want to be in this part of the world anymore. Maybe that's maybe they're not asking those questions means they kind of want to move on to something different. I don't know. What would your advice be if they're not really picking up the mystery of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's kind of complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I am leery of the NPC being. Did you notice that quite what we thought it was? And the reason that I'm leery of that is because I don't like for NPCs to be the GM's mouthpiece.
Mm.
And in fact, I will go out of my way to have NPCs make sort of declarative statements that sound like it's coming from the voice of, it sounds like it's coming from the GM, and then the NPC is totally wrong, right?
Yeah.
Because real people can be wrong, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and if you start thinking that every NPC is the GM, then you're just gonna think of NPCs as little hint monsters.
Clippy, yeah. Right.
It looks like you're on a dungeon adventure. So I would rather do the other suggestion that you had, which is rely on the character choices that they've made, right? And kind of delve into that whole, your character knows more than you do.
Right.
And so, your keen eye notices that this isn't quite what you thought it was going to be. The other thing that I like to do, though, is let the players go blissfully on and then learn of the implications of the unanswered questions later, right? So, I don't know. I'm having a difficult time coming up with just an easy example, right? But like, they bring the cure back to the town and say, here it is, right? And then they go off, and then they suddenly hear about weird things happening in the town, like the cure, like the disease was cured, but now everyone is, acting strangely and, seems to be taking on emotions that they didn't used to have or whatever. And because what I'm doing is I'm saying that the setting kind of goes on with or without the players, right? And there sort of is this objective reality, and so we didn't look very closely at the cure before we gave it to the townsfolk. We didn't realize it was cursed or whatever it is, right? And that's not to make them feel bad. It's just to kind of it gives verisimilitude to your setting, right? And it suggests it does suggest being a little more careful next time, right?
It suggests they're really being rewarded when they are careful, right? And
yes, I like that.
That feels really great as a player, and it feels, when you were like, it feels a good dread. Like when you sort of screw it up and you're like, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that. Oh no, but excitement. No, right?
Right. But there really is nothing sort of more satisfying as a player than to notice the thing that would have gone bad and stop it from
totally
before it was going to happen, right? Because you feel really smart, right? And that's always a good feeling.
Oh, it really is. and you're going to deprive your players of that if you're always giving them too much in the way of hints or guiding their hand. So I think it's a really good point.
Right. Or just always having things work out the way they are expecting. Yeah.
Right.
So one of the things that we've kind of been, talking about, through implication is, there are things that you can do that are great, and there are things that you can do where you screw up, right?
Oh,
there are missteps that you can make. So you're running a game, Darcy, and that something went wrong, right? Yeah. Whether you paced it all wrong, or you had an NPC do something they shouldn't have done, or you bored everyone, or whatever it is. What do you do? What's the next step? How do you deal with that?
I love GMing so much. I adore it to bits. It's like my favorite activity. And I think when I'm in it, I'm sort of giving my all to it. And so when I sort of end a session, or if I end a scene and I realize something went wrong, I'm usually not quite in the right space to fully understand it and to fully evaluate, especially if it's sort of a kind of complicated error, right? Like, oh, back there I did something, and the retcon would be kind of tough. So like, or if it's a kind of an emotional thing, right? If something felt really off about the emotions of the play space, and I'm worried some players having a bad time. So I think like the first thing that's really important to me is getting a little bit of distance from it. I think I really need that distance a lot of times. And so that might be taking 5, that might be, getting up from the table at the end of the session and grabbing a water before we sort of, chit chat at the end and have a little discussion about it. But building that space for myself is really important. And if in that, 2-minute period, no insights have come, then I know it's the time to sort of try to turn to either the play group as a whole, or sometimes, I have like a player who's a really good GM. And so I can ask, hey, from your perspective, like this felt off. Can you workshop that with me? Can you talk about why that might have felt off? So there's sort of the investigation phase of like, okay, what happened and why did it happen that way? And then there's what do we do about it next? And I think it's helpful for me to often separate those and not just try to immediately like freak out and find a solution. I think I'm always wanting to be like the quick GM. And so sometimes I have to slow myself down to get the best processing.
Yeah, I think that I'm a big fan of owning up to your mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? Like if we, play a game and we're all feeling kind of down about the session afterward, yeah. I might actually, send an email to all the players, right? Or start out the next session talking and saying, that big long combat was kind of a slog. And I'm aware of that. And I know, I could tell you guys were kind of getting a little bored.
Yeah.
And just say, what do you guys think we could do to make sure that doesn't happen again? Because I know I'm going to take some steps, right?
Yeah.
And find out, maybe there's ways they can, speed things up, or maybe there's ways that you can change the way you run the combats or whatever. And I mean, that's kind of a simple mistake to make, but I mean, just sort of saying to them that was a mistake.
Yeah.
And I'm going to work to make sure that doesn't happen again. Do you mind helping? It gives them something to do, but it also tells them, look, I didn't like that in the same way that you didn't like that. And that's informative, right? Because you go away and you think, wow, that game that Monte ran was just one big boring combat slog.
Right.
And it was really boring. I'm not going to play in his games anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, nobody likes to make mistakes. Nobody likes to own up to them, but it's probably the best thing to do, right?
And man, we've talked about this across the series too, about kind of how a lot of GM advice and player advice comes down to having a good conversation about it, and how even having an imperfect conversation about it sets the tone that this is something we can talk about. Just as a player, I think about how sometimes I've not felt like I'm sure that I can speak up and not offend the GM about something that isn't working for me. So when a GM comes and says, hey, that felt really off, like, let's fix this. That communicates so much to me as a player that like we can work together to continue to improve this experience, and that it is a worthwhile effort for our time, because RPGs are hard. They're hard to schedule. They take a lot of time. And so it really matters when players and GMs are kind of able to own their mistakes and kind of without dwelling upon it endlessly, try to pick up and do better in the future. And I think sometimes there is a temptation to sort of self-flagellate, and it is so not worth it.
I agree, right? I mean, if you think of it this way, it's like, even your favorite novelist, right? You're not reading their first draft. Right, you're not reading it's unedited, right? And so sometimes, I mean, RPG is sort of live, and so editing is hard. But sometimes you can do it, right? Like, in a previous video, we were talking about give players after the first couple of sessions, give players the ability to kind of rejigger their characters a little bit. I think that we should afford GMs the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, if somebody has a magic item and it's just way too powerful, right? You're not stuck, right? Just talk to them and say, hey, you know what? that is that ability for that magic item. It's wrecking the campaign. It's not gonna be fun. Let's do this instead, right? And propose and just talk to them, and maybe they'll kind of come back and say, well, what if we did this instead, right? And it can be a negotiation, a conversation, and but you know, you shouldn't, if you're running a year-long campaign and you make a mistake in session 3, you shouldn't have to live with it for the rest of the year.
Yeah, there's a question, I think, either in one of the comments of a previous video when we streamed it, or possibly on Twitter, but it was about how to sort of pick yourself up after mistakes too, right? I think, there's so much work that, sometimes you put into things as a GM, and it can feel so personal because it's, all flowing through you and it's improvised, and it can be really, the joy, the highs of it can be so high, but when you really feel like you kind of let players down in the session or something, it can be pretty demoralizing. And, I think like letting things fester is the worst thing you can do, right? About, if you're harboring this like awful feeling about, oh, I really messed that up, and we're continuing to live with the consequences, I think not talking about it is only going to make it worse. And so I think, like, again, owning up to, hey, that felt weird. I think I made a mistake here. It clears the air a lot for you and for the other players. So like that's a definite first step that makes things a lot less heavy. Is there anything else that you would advise someone to do if they're feeling kind of like unsure of themselves after sort of making a big error or something?
Well, I guess I would try to remind myself that despite the title Game Master, right? Everyone around the table, I mean, it's a grouped storytelling experience. Yeah. So yes, you might screw up and a player might screw up. But it's a group activity. And so you are not solely responsible for everything, right? And so I think that you can take a little bit of the weight off of your own shoulders and kind of say, okay, so this didn't work, guys. What are we gonna do next time to make sure that does work?
Yeah.
And put that before the group, realizing that, because it's a group storytelling experience, solutions for problems should be group solutions, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of your best game ever, especially if you've been following along, the book talks a lot about how, historically a little bit too much gets put on the shoulders of the game master when it really works better and is a little more equitable, onus wise, if we sort of share a lot of that responsibility amongst ourselves. I think that's a great point. And, I think just like you talked about, books, we're looking at multiple drafts. People make mistakes all the time. TV shows live with lots of wild mistakes all the time. And so it is just going to happen. And so it's, I'll, definitely look forward to how not to let this particular thing happen again, but you're going to miss out on being bold and trying really cool new things if you're living too much in the fear of failure. So failure is learning. It's really exciting. Fail interestingly, right? And sort of go headlong into the next session. And I think what helps me a lot is just powering through, and like, if I think I understand what happened, I'm going to try not to do it again, and just like really try to psych myself up for the next session. I
think you can turn this whole problem on its head, right? And say, like, if we all are, if we all are okay with me making mistakes as the GM sometimes, and I know that, if I do something wrong, we can just walk it back or whatever, that gives me the ability to be more bold, right? And to take risks and interesting things. So I think that can be really helpful and empowering. And I'm going to throw, I know we're going to wrap up here, but I wanted to throw one more thing out there. If you really want to improve your GMing, record your sessions and listen to them. And sometimes it'll be a little painful. You'll be like, oh, I shouldn't have said that thing or whatever, but But you'll also be able to pick up on the things that your players really liked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you'll know to do them again differently, or rather the same. And the things they don't like, you can do differently. And it's just a really, really helpful tool. And you can do this via video. You can do it just, sound on your computer or whatever, right? It's really easy. Make sure you get everyone's permission first, and just make it clear you're only doing this for yourself. But it's a really useful tool.
Absolutely. And, I've done it even just with like a, really bad laptop speaker, microphone, right? And it's not even in the center of the table, but with if you Google sort of how to level, audio that's really bumpy, right? That has like lots of quiet voices. There's easy ways to do that. And if you're just kind of listening for yourself, right? It doesn't matter that a bunch of people are really quiet and the audio is really tinny. You will get what you need out of it, even with extremely lo-fi, kind of messy technology. So just go for it. I love getting to it. Both reminds me what happens in a session. So sometimes if I know I'm not running sessions for very frequently, I'll do that to sort of remind myself. But yeah, you just can't beat sort of with a fresh mind, like listening and analyzing through a whole session. You will learn so much about yourself and your players.
Yeah. I think it's really great. So we have now done 3 videos on advanced GMing. There's a million more videos worth of stuff to talk about. But a lot of this is in Your Best Game Ever. We hope that you'll take the time to kind of look through the chapters on GMing. There's a whole chapter on dynamic GMing. It's because it's something that's so near and dear to my heart that I put a lot of focus on it. I hope you guys will all have your best game ever.
Thank you so much, everybody. Come GM for me with all your super cool hacks and great tricks.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.